I debated how do I present this given the fact that there's very little time. I'm going to try to touch upon 3 or 4 points. I hope that that will be the best way to do it. And as I said, when I hear from our moderator, I will stop. Okay? So, this is one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite writers, actually, Albert Camus. And it's concerning his assessment of what was going on in the mid part of the 20th century and also in the period which preceded that. He says, there are crimes of passion and crimes of logic. The line that divides them is not clear, but the penal code distinguishes between them by the useful concept of premeditation. He goes on to say, we are living in the era of premeditation and perfect crimes. Our criminals are no longer those helpless children who pleaded love as their excuse. On the contrary, they are adults, and they have a perfect alibi, philosophy, which can be used for any purpose, even for transforming murderers into judges. Indeed, Camus was accurate when he wrote this in 1951 in The Rebel. He had already experienced the impact of what had happened within Nazi Germany. And also, he was aware of the many things that had begun to happen within the Soviet Union by that time. And all of that finally became fact and became accepted by virtually the whole of mainstream society because of a book which appeared in the 1990s by Stéphane Courtois, which is called The Black Book of Communism. And all media accepted the book and the shocking findings there of some 100 million people that had been victims of Stalin, Mao, and others. So, Reverend Moon made a rather bold declaration in August of 1985. And in 1985, he declared that communism was coming to an end. He did so before a group of academics, actually in a situation very similar to the kind of conference that we have this weekend. And he had a document written which was called The End of Communism, and also there's a series of books which specifically deal with the contents of the proceedings of the Geneva Conference of 1985. One of the people that detected and recognized the veracity of the observations of Reverend Moon was a gentleman by the name of Peter Rutland, who wrote an article in the National Interest. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the National Interest, but the National Interest is the journal which featured Francis Fukuyama's article, which is called The End of History, actually saying that somehow the whole history of totalitarian and authoritarian rule was coming to an end, and that there would be a new era of democracy. And there was a huge debate in the United States between two scholars, Fukuyama and Samuel Huntington, specifically dealing with this topic. Anyways, I just make the point that the National Interest is a very serious journal. And in his article, Peter Rutland recognized that there had only been 2 institutions or groups of people that had correctly predicted the demise of communism. One of them was Dr. Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor to President Jimmy Carter. And the other, to Rutland's surprise, was Reverend Moon's organizations. And he says in that article, which you can certainly, it's spring 1993, pages 109 to 122, only these 2 were able to predict this. And he kind of joked about the idea that Reverend Moon had been involved in this. He didn't take it seriously. He didn't believe, actually, that Reverend Moon had something substantial to do with addressing the problem of communism. And actually, that's what provoked me to write my book in 2005 called March to Moscow, which is a very detailed documented text which deals specifically with all the things that Reverend Moon did over 5 decades in dealing with the problem of communism in the world. It all began for Reverend Moon right after World War II, when he went to North Korea and he spent time in a detention camp there, actually a concentration camp, as a prisoner of conscience. He was there for almost 3 years. And during that period of time, he became very aware of Marxist philosophy. They had to study it, they had to learn it, and he recognized that there were some fundamental issues within it that didn't function correctly. I first met Reverend Moon in 1972. I had been a member of the Unification Church, and it was in 1972 that I learned he was coming to Paris, where I had joined our church. And it was at that time that he visited there, and I knew he was going to talk about religion, but I also thought he would talk about communism. And my horror was I anticipated that he was going to say some things which I didn't want to hear, because my expectation was that he was going to tell us all about how many people Stalin killed and how many people Mao killed. And in my own mind, I would say right away, because I was a person who came from the left, to be very blunt, I would have said, well, what about Pak Chung-hee and the people that he repressed? And what about Rafael Trujillo, who was the brutal dictator in the Dominican Republic? What about all the things he did? What about the situation of apartheid in South Africa? Both sides have problems. That was my view. So I was anticipating that he was going to do that, and I thought that would be a real turnoff for me. However, that isn't what he did. He did something which totally disarmed me, because he went to the very center, the very metaphysics of Marxism-Leninism, dialectical materialism. In the Soviet Union, Marxism is sometimes referred to simply as diamat, dialectical materialism, as the heart of everything. And at the basis of that is the notion that the most fundamental dynamic within nature is contradiction. And it seemed to make sense to me until I heard Reverend Moon speak. That was in Paris in March of 1972. And he said, you know, Marx was wrong. The fundamental dynamic within nature is not one of conflict. It's one of reciprocity. The relationship between a proton and an electron is not one of struggle, as is indicated by Viktor Afanasyev. Those of you who know Afanasyev, who was the famous Soviet Marxist philosopher, the last one we can say, was this idea that the fundamental dynamic was conflict. He said, no, it's not true. The fundamental way in which things are created and things are maintained is through a dynamic of reciprocity, of give and take action. Proton and electron, because there is this exchange, not conflict, because there is this exchange, a hydrogen atom can be formed, or molecules can be created, or through stamen and pistil, seeds are produced, or through male and female animals, you have offspring, or man and woman, children are created. And I was blown away. I was blown away because for the first time I understood the reason why, in spite of Marxism's eloquent hope to do certain things, the reason why it couldn't happen was because fundamentally, the problem within Marxism was the fact that its metaphysics, its fundamental dynamic was wrong. And therefore, it could never change the world. And Reverend Moon did an extensive analysis of Marxism. It wasn't to bash Marxism, it was just to look at it honestly. And if you look at that, and myself and Professor Lay, we worked on this for several years, based upon the work that he had done. And we put together a lecture manual, which in the 1980s and early 1990s got a lot of powerful and positive comments. In his book, Jesuits, the Church, and Marxism, Ricardo de la Sierva, who was Minister of Culture of Spain, he spoke about the textbook that Reverend Moon had inspired, and he said that the Causa International movement has published a lecture manual that seems to me to be the best generic study of Marxism from within the anti-Marxist camp. And William Rusher, a very amazing American speaker, and for many years also the editor of the National Review, he said, I have enormous respect for the work Causa does, for the analysis which is clear, accurate, and honest, and looks in the round at these questions. These conferences organized by Causa are organized and conducted all over the United States to call to the attention of leadership personalities like yourselves the rather intricate aspects of communism that get overlooked in our daily debates. December 25th, 1991, we know that the Soviet Union collapsed. Actually, I was in Moscow at the time, the day that it collapsed. So that's a long story, no time to tell it. But anyways, that was a remarkable experience, if you will. And Reverend Moon's first thought was not, oh, they're down, let's step on them. No. His first thought was, how do we somehow not let the Soviet Union feel humiliated? And he went to the Soviet Union, and actually myself and Professor Lay, we were involved in seminars which were around the idea of seeing if there's any way to somehow keep the 15 republics of the Soviet Union together. And with a different ideological approach, somehow to be able to turn that around. That was his heart. He wanted the Russian people to have their dignity and somehow in that way to be able to further peace. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. He put tremendous energy in trying to make it happen, but it did not. I have to move quickly. To conclude, I just want to say a few things about North Korea. Some of you might be aware that on June 25th, 2018, there was an announcement that North Korea had canceled its annual anti-U.S. rally because relations have improved following the Trump-Kim meeting. But that was not the first time. That was not the first time that those anti-American demonstrations were stopped. In November 1991, Reverend Moon traveled to North Korea. He had an amazing experience with Kim Il-sung. If you can imagine, he had spent 3 years in a concentration camp under Kim Il-sung. He was seen as the enemy. There were so many negative things. Even there was the FBI. They captured in the late 1980s a Japanese Red Army figure by the name of Yu Kikimura, who had been sent to the United States to assassinate Reverend Moon. They found the list, the plans, everything, what he was planning to do. And yet, in the midst of that, Reverend Moon began to make plans to go to North Korea. And he went to North Korea in 1991. He'd been imprisoned in North Korea. And then, in addition to that, then he had to escape and basically tortured, went through all kinds of ordeals during that period of time. But when he met Kim Il-sung, do you know what he did? He just put out his arms and he hugged him, embraced him, and said, "You are my elder brother," because Kim Il-sung was older than him. And he said, "Blood is thicker than water. Let's forget about the past and let's look towards the future." And Reverend Moon began a series of initiatives during that period of time to effect change in North Korea. In May and June of 1992, he actually organized a group of Americans who had all formerly held office in the United States government. Many former congressmen, many former senators, many former members of the State Department, even members of the CIA, a whole group of people that went to North Korea with a specific focus. And the focus was what can be done as a first step to end the abusive language between the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That was the focus. And that focus was cleared before we left the United States with Brent Scowcroft, who at that time was the National Security Advisor of George H.W. Bush. So we traveled there and we spent a week in North Korea engaging specifically on this topic. And afterwards, just so you know, I actually went there. Afterwards, I was invited to stay for another week in North Korea in order to try to work out some kind of a framework in order to be able to go forward between North Korea and the United States in terms of relations. And we worked to draft a proposal, and it turned out at the end I was told, look, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs likes your proposal, the Ministry of Information does not. It's not going to go forward. But they said to me, I left there on the 6th of June, they said, something is going to happen, we promise you, because of the things that transpired here. So anyways, I came back to the United States, and on the 22nd of June, 1992, I received a phone call from Ambassador Ho Jong from North Korea, who was the Deputy Permanent Representative of the UN from North Korea. And he asked to have a meeting between myself and the person who had been the head of our delegation, whose name was Congressman Richard Eichord. And we met with him on the 23rd of June. And he explained to us, he said every year in North Korea, between June 25th, that's the day the Korean War started, and July 27th, that's the day the armistice was signed in 1953 to end the war, there is a 1 month period which is called Hate America Month. And he said, this year, I called you here to tell you that we are canceling Hate America Month. And President Kim Il-sung made the decision to do that. And he said, do you know why I called you here? He said, I called you here because I want your group to be the ones that reported to the White House. Normally it's supposed to go through, it was Ambassador James Lilly from China, who was in China from the US at that time. Usually it goes through the China embassy. But I want it to go through you because I want to make sure that the United States knows the important role that Reverend Moon is playing in trying to somehow improve relations between North Korea and the United States. And so Congressman Eichhorn met with both Brent Scowcroft and President George Bush concerning this matter. What were the reasons for the first cancellation? The reasons were, first of all, Reverend Moon's visit to North, we were given 3 explicit reasons why it was canceled. Number one, the very warm, intentional visit of Reverend Moon to North Korea. Secondly, the Washington Times did an interview and Mr. Bill Gertz knows about this, with President Kim Il-sung. He was happy because he was actually just able to share his own words at that time. And thirdly, because of the visit of the American Freedom Coalition under Congressman Eichhorn, which I was lucky enough to be a part of. Because of those 3 things, the decision was made to cancel Hate America Month. That was the first time that it was done, actually. And since that time, Reverend Moon has regularly worked. And it was announced, by the way, just so you know, you can check this yourself. It was announced in an editorial in the Washington Times on June 25th, 1992, so that they knew what had happened and how it happened, and we could scoop it because it had come to us first and foremost. That's all I can say for now, but thank you very much.